Welcome to the last lecture of fall 2023. We made it. And the last lecture will be done by one of our very own people, Jason Montgomery, our relatively new, not new anymore, Jason. So it's always good, as I said when I presented Annan, to have a colleague that deserves to be in this lecture series. Not everybody deserves to be in this lecture series. We earned that right. Very much like you earned the right for an A or not, so do we, faculty. And you earned that right to be here in the podium to give a lecture for just a few things that you could really raise to. One of them for sure is to write a book. This is something very traditional in all architecture schools. Of course, great practice will get you here, great building, great honors and awards and so on. But it's not easy to invite faculty, colleagues to the lecture series. I never do that. I ran lecture series for a long time in many different schools. And I always avoid to invite colleagues because, of course, you just invite your friends, which is the last thing you want to do. You invite people that, frankly, deserve to be in this podium, deserve for you to listen to. Everybody deserves to be listened, so don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But you know what my point is. At one point, maybe you want to be in this podium. Would you like to be in this podium? One who wish that you have that desire, that drive inside you. Would you? Years of practice get you here. Please devote yourself to such desire. We need that kind of passion and commitment to architecture to make this world better in the way we architects know how to do or try to do. All right, that was my sermon for today. I can't help myself. Anybody needs an AI credit, whether you're online, in that case, you send me an email, or you're here, you write your name here, I'll take care of it. And let me introduce Jason, which is a pleasure to introduce. Jason is an architect, urban designer, scholar, and educator. His professional career spans several international practices, including Porphyrios Associates, Cooper Robertson and Partners, and Hart Howerton, where Jason was a principal. At these practices, Jason led design projects in Greece, Bermuda, Morocco, Costa Rica, England, Egypt, and many locations across the United States. These projects include the extension to Selwyn College in Cambridge, the Columbia School of Social Work, a study for a new town center for Redondo Beach, California, and the site analysis for a new residential college at Yale University. He's currently a principal at Montgomery Architect. Jason's research reflects his broad interest in architecture, urban design, and research methodology, focusing in particular on the nature of place, rural and urban space, and building tectonics. He's currently leading research on the detailed analysis of the process of urbanization and evolution of urban form in specific contexts. Working with an international research organization, AMPS, Architecture, Media, Politics, and Society, he co-organized international conferences addressing the livability of cities and the complexity and changing natures of cities. He's also co-organized in New York symposia on evolution of downtown Brooklyn and housing along the Brooklyn waterfront. He was the editor of a recently published volume called Place-Based Sustainability, Research and Design Extending Pathways for Ecological Stewardship, and a special issue of AMPS journal, Reimagining the City, Urban Space in the Post-COVID City. He's currently preparing a new book proposal for an edited volume on living in cities focused on wellness and health. Professor Montgomery's teaching experience includes appointment not only here at CUA, of course, but also a new Notre Dame University's Rome program, Yale University, the City University of New York, and Andrews University. He holds a Master's of the Arts from the University of Wales at Cardiff, a graduate diploma from the Prince of Wales Institute for Architecture, and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame. It's been a pleasure to have Jason as a colleague. He's friendly, he's open-minded, he really cares, and he's a companion in this journey of teaching together. So let's welcome Jason to the podium, a deserved podium.
Thank you very much, Julio. Thank you. Thank you, Julio. Thank you to the Walton family for sponsoring and supporting this great lecture series. It's an incredible honor to be speaking anywhere in this series. To be speaking at the end also feels quite significant, with Travis having started us off at the beginning. I definitely would like to respect many of the themes that were raised. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good. So many of the themes that were raised throughout this series, including, spirit of place, and also questions of doing no harm in our work, those two in particular, and hopefully bring that to a conclusion. I also feel like this is my kind of coming out to the school, because I've been part-time last year, full-time this is my first semester, and so I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to speak for the first time to the school and friends of the school on a broader basis. Okay, good. All right, so to begin, I'd like to dedicate this talk this evening first to my wife, Anne, who is in the audience, my son, Jackson, and my daughter, Cecilia, who are not here today, as their loving sacrifice has made my joining this community possible. Next, I wish to present this talk in memory of my father, Kenneth Leon Montgomery, a professor like me, and most poignantly, my mother, Joan Ellen Montgomery, a librarian and a woman of the world, born in Brooklyn in 1934 and raised in Washington, D.C., who embarked on a European tour by herself in the 1960s. A single woman braving a wide world because there was no other way to get to see and know the great works of art and culture. I have no doubt that being a dorky but passionate teacher comes from my dad, and my love of architecture and cities from my mom. When I reflect on cities, sorry, let's do this. Oh yeah, okay, got it, yep. Got it, okay. When I reflect on cities and urban life, human flourishing emerges, and I'm not gonna read the whole time, I'm just gonna read this preamble, so just, my son said, definitely don't read it. When I reflect on cities and urban life, human flourishing emerges as an essential potentiality. Cities can be defined by the density of people, working, playing, praying in close proximity. And this proximity puts the social relationships of people at the core of discussions of cities. It seems clear, particularly after a global health crisis, that our fates, dreams, aspirations in life are tied together. We cannot strive for our hoped future alone in cities. Ambrogio Lorenzetti, in his 14th century frescoes in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, challenges political leadership to consider the relationship between governance, cities, and the countryside. When governance is doing its job, so to speak, Lorenzetti shows us the city scene where people are at peace, happy, living in community, going about daily tasks, but also celebrating, dancing, holding hands. The buildings provide a rich environment of color, proportion, detail. The streets and squares are bustling, a shared spatial realm where life happens. Lorenzetti depicts the city in a way we can appreciate and understand. Other artists in more modern times have pondered about the future of the city. This image was published in Popular Science Monthly in 1934, an artist's illustration of a British writer, Reginald Howard Walensky, who is known for his writing about modern art. This image is clearly out there, but illustrates for us that the image of the city depicted by Lorenzetti was challenged in the 20th century. Futuristic projections like this wipe away the urban form of streets, blocks, and squares, and replace this form with other things like megastructural systems or a world of roads and buildings and gardens. In this image, in fact, people are not really that important, apparently, in an image of a city like this. If we place human flourishing at the center of a conversation about cities, we must explore what flourishing may mean. One reflection on human flourishing is offered by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. For humans to flourish, they write, it means we are on a path towards physical and mental well-being that's holistically good, but both for individuals and communities. This organization takes the position that, quote, human flourishing begins with self-determination and agency, scaffolded by strong social relationships. We flourish when we live with purpose, when we practice gratitude, forgiveness, and open-mindedness. We cultivate character, strength, and resilience to flourish in adversity, to lead with empathy and virtue. We flourish by maintaining a sense of wonder, curiosity, and humility about the world we all share and our place in it. Our focus on flourishing is concerned with studying how an extension of these interior traits, habits, and behaviors can impact social goals, end quote. So let's ask a question or a number of questions. Does urban form have a significant impact on human flourishing in cities? Could it be that a critical role of urban form is to put us in relationship with each other? Put us in spaces where we can peacefully go about our daily activity with others while others do the same? Can urban form help us to cultivate empathy for our neighbors, foster a sense of shared destiny, not only human destiny, but also the destiny of the natural world? Can urban form provide places of meaning? Can urban form help us come together to mark important moments and events, to celebrate and dance, to savor the beauty of our lives together? I think you know at this point that I believe that urban form has an important role to play in human flourishing. My observations and research suggest the following. Central to any discussion of cities today are issues that have critical impacts on human flourishing and prosperity: justice, social equity, resilience and economic flourishing, health, housing, environmental sustainability and resiliency, ecological health, biodiversity, education. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the critical issues. Human flourishing relies on a built and natural environment that is fundamentally linked by human flourishing relies on a built and natural environment where they are fundamentally linked, as human flourishing is dependent on the flourishing of nature and the Earth's ecosystem. Urban design and planning in cities must address with great sensitivity and intentionality the least advantaged, marginalized, and vulnerable communities that are impacted the most by challenges facing cities. The public network or connectivity of streets and squares is a fundamental social infrastructure. Density is a social and ecological opportunity across the spectrum of the transect that we see in this image. These observations are not unique or earth-shattering. They are my confirmation of centuries of knowledge and building of cities and decades of scholarship of professional work by others. The discussion is not centered on new invention or creative genius. It is about understanding what cities are and where their potential lies. So that is my preamble. And so what I'd like to do is take you on a narrative that maybe combines more personal lived experience with my research and tries to pull together these ideas around human flourishing in cities. So to begin with, in this image, you can see the house I grew up in, the elementary school I went to, the middle school I went to, and the high school I went to. Obviously a very suburban environment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was my street. My house is on the right in orange, and it's the one with a few solar panels on the roof in the plan. Notice no sidewalks, low density 1950s suburb. So that was my environment growing up, as many of you in the room might have had similar lived experience. But growing up in the city, I also got to travel around. My father was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, so we would go over to that part of the city often. And I would see nuggets of urbanism like these, going up the side of the Strip District, up the hill towards Pitt, to the Hill District, or on the south side where there's a beautiful market building surrounded on four corners by special block configuration. So I was getting a sense of urbanism and what it could mean. But then, of course, I had the great privilege to go to Notre Dame undergraduate for my undergraduate studies in architecture, which sent me by their system, all third-year undergraduates go to Rome. So Rome, of course, for a Notre Dame undergraduate who studied architecture, is a profound starting point for understanding urbanism. It's the first time most of us lived in a city. First time most of us could walk anywhere we needed to go. It was the first time we could hang out in a public space that we had never really had a sense of what that even meant before that experience. And certainly any student of Rome thinks of cities in spatial relationships. And so the Noli Plan of Rome from the 18th century gives us this guide of how to think about urban space and interior space in critical relationships. So when I ask my students to draw a Noli Plan, that's of course it's a variation on that. So Roman urbanism, of course, is very unique, and the Italian peninsula is its own world, and every part of the world based on its climate or culture has different characteristics of urbanism. So going to graduate school in London, for me, was a great companion to studying in Rome. And so the school where I studied was right on the edge of Regent's Park here. We were in these two houses in Gloucester Gate around Regent's Park, right near Camden Town. And so I began to get a new understanding of architecture and urbanism through an English planning perspective, adding to my arsenal of what I was able to learn from studying in Rome. And then, of course, I got a great opportunity to work for some great architects who got to teach me or give me opportunities to design and apply those lessons of urbanism. So for example, here with Porphyrius Associates, we got to do, this is Selwyn College, a 19th century college on the other side of the river from the heart of Cambridge. Here's James Sterling's library as reference. And we got to do a master plan and think about how this college would grow. And we planned the new dormitories and residential buildings and a new library, mixed use building. And this was a kind of urbanism of the other side of Cambridge. It was an infill project. It made a kind of whole out of all the parts of the college. When I was a principal at Hart-Howerton, we had the opportunity to work on Lulu Island, an unbuilt project in Abu Dhabi, but we got a chance to explore what it meant to make housing and new public spaces and art galleries and a mosque and also in a hotel, all in the point of this massive master plan project that we were leading this kind of central core on. So we were designing housing around all the norms of the local culture and working hard on the environmental aspects of this project in terms of cooling, passive cooling, and so forth. Also at Hart-Howerton, I had the great opportunity to essentially design a new city. This is for the Boy Scouts of America. They were looking for land to build their new center for their National Jamboree. The National Jamboree, happening every 4 years, pulls together 40,000 Boy Scouts and adult leaders, along with another 10,000 staff people. So we ended up working in the mountains of West Virginia on 10,000 acres, and I was the lead designer of how we could carve out and plan the campsites, the key public buildings, and so forth, all the pathways and connections. A really rare opportunity to design a city. And then architect asked us to get involved in an ongoing project in Redondo Beach, California. And this doesn't show our design, but what we see on the left is a fire atlas map from 1916. And then we see the current condition in Google Earth on the right. And this is a town on the coast of California where they literally bulldozed their downtown and built the condos you see in the middle of the screen. And this project really brought home for me a kind of key theme of how I think about cities. And so I would say this key theme I would call repair. A huge part of the way I look at working in urban environments is to often undo damage that has been done previously and try to bring back something that was lost. So this idea of the fire atlas really sparked a whole bunch of things for me. It sparked a way of looking at the city, a way of researching the city, and even a way of teaching the city. So the way I brought it into teaching the city was to say, if we could bring students in contact with, say, primary source information like historic maps and photographs, if we could bring them out and do careful observation of the streets, of the systems of the city, if we could have them tour and walk and do transit walks, and in this example, walk through public housing with the manager of that public housing estate, we could begin to build, and this is all with students who are not necessarily architecture students all across the college I was teaching at in Brooklyn, nurses, engineers, and so forth. We could bring this idea of thinking about repair in cities and human flourishing to a broader set of young people who could help make change. And I published a few chapters outlining this pedagogy of what I called learning places. So when I think about repair and I think about urbanism, of course, when you think about urbanism in general, it is a vastly inclusive topic. There's almost no topic you can think of that has anything to do with a built environment that is not impacting cities, but also, of course, social, political, environmental issues. So if you want, as an urbanist, you're constantly trying to plug into all the major topics that are constantly evolving and current topics, not necessarily historical concepts. So I'm constantly collecting a kind of lit review of key issues, whether we're talking about heat in cities, or we're talking about how Paris is going to try to cool the city, or we're talking about social fragmentation in American neighborhoods, or the impact of parking lots and driving in cities and on the carbon footprint of the United States. All of these things together, are adding up to a knowledge base of urbanism, but also so many of them are pertaining to this notion of repair, of how do we repair these conditions. So this is just a small sampling of a huge amount. America's not ready for climate disasters. I think, we have insurance companies all over the country that are pulling out of states and are going to say, we're no longer going to insure your home against climate disaster because it's no longer economically feasible. So as an urbanist, you have so much to be considering at the same time. And I'd say that this, of my recent research or paying attention to what's out there, I find the most scary, which is in the United States, we are drawing down groundwater at enormous rates without regulation. And if you go to the major aquifer in the western part of the United States, between Kansas and Colorado, they're back to 1960s outputs in their agricultural production. So we're going backwards in time. Nobody can live without water. Every city needs good water. They're building cities in the deserts where there is no water. As you may be aware, Arizona just locked down the development of new development because essentially nobody can prove that they can meet the standard of 100 years of water supply for their new developments. So the earth is, so there's a need for repair on so many different levels, from a social level, from a planning level, from an environmental, ecological level. We have a lot of work to be done. So repair really became a major theme for me thinking about downtown Brooklyn. This is downtown Brooklyn, and when I was a professor at City Tech, where I was for 14 years, that's our main complex. And then here's where the architecture school with some other engineering and so forth are up here in downtown Brooklyn. This is 1924. This is 1951. You almost would think that the Blitz in London had repeated itself in downtown Brooklyn with a disruption, urban disruption. Of course, this disruption was planned with good intentions. They were going to build a new civic center. They were going to clean up where the red light district was in the neighborhood. It was going to be this brand new kind of series of public buildings surrounding the space. Of course, most of which never really happened after the demolition of that core of downtown Brooklyn. So as a studio in Brooklyn with my undergraduate students there, we started to delve into what is at issue with this neighborhood. And we came to a central issue, which I would say, when I talk about repair, I would say the first aspect of repair that I would look at as an urbanist is connectivity. The notion of connectivity sounds like a very simplistic idea within the urban structure, but connectivity can impact everything from, can you get your kids to school easily? Can you get to the grocery store where you can buy good produce? Can you walk safely down the street? Can you walk at all, or do you need to be in a car to get anywhere? Do you have orientation? How do you visit your neighbors? So we studied downtown Brooklyn in all these different ways. We looked at all the barriers of high-speed roads or highways. We looked at the block sizes and so forth. And then we came up with a master plan as a studio of how to redevelop certain components of this downtown core around the notion of connectivity. Repairing that city that was literally that downtown that was torn apart and kind of sitting in this really dysfunctional process. The connectivity we were also looking at in this particular project was critical because to the east of the site was major public housing with almost 100% Black population, and to the west was one of the most wealthy neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Brooklyn Heights, a largely affluent community of majority white. And so the barriers between, in this case, to me, were also about reconnecting populations that had little reason to have contact, and also to take people that were living in isolation and give them more opportunity through that connectivity. So connectivity can be seen as a question of social justice. Studying downtown Brooklyn further, I had the opportunity to host a talk by the president of the Municipal Arts Society at our college, and we were talking about the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway is one of the many urban roads that we see through American cities all over the country. That in those urban roads, those urban freeways or parkways or expressways are often critical dividers between one community and another. So here we see the study of the different alignment proposals for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. We see little variations in them. And then we see this one dashed line that kind of cuts up and then cuts down, because this road actually was going to impact what's considered the first historic district of the United States, which is Brooklyn Heights, this neighborhood right here. This is the area we were looking at a second ago. So this road was being planned, and Robert Moses is a name often heard in New York planning. Through whatever negotiations, and the historians are a little questionable about how it worked, they decided to build this portion of the highway in this incredibly sensitive manner, in which all the buildings on the top of this image were preserved, all the buildings on the lower edge of the image were preserved, and a road, 2 levels of highway, and a public promenade were needle thread into this part of Brooklyn, which happened to be, of course, still or even back then, a very affluent neighborhood of Brooklyn. The other parts of Brooklyn didn't fare quite the same. Take Red Hook, for example, where as the city was urbanizing, a main street was developed that would actually connect the neighborhoods going to the north and the neighborhoods going to the south. So this street, which we can see here, was going to be a natural kind of development of the commercial street and connecting all the neighborhoods. And that route became very attractive to the planners. And so that became this massive highway connector condition connecting the Battery Park or the Battery Tunnel Bridge traffic, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway with the Iguanas Expressway. And it leaves now this whole zone of Red Hook, which of course has one of the largest public housing sites in all of New York City, heavily isolated from the rest of Brooklyn. And this is like the most attractive place to cross underneath of that condition. So connectivity in urban form clearly can have major impacts on human flourishing. It can make people feel they can't really leave their own neighborhood. It can make leaving the neighborhood feel like, you know, you're going past an environmental, you know, kind of rough spot of all the pollution, all the noise coming from all the cars, as well as the threat of not making it across those wide streets with so many cars safely. And of course, you could look into all the data and research on this notion of how the urban freeways clearly have had an impact on connectivity of urban neighborhoods. So this New York Times study shows that Houston was actually proposing recently to actually expand their urban highway, which we can see in that kind of orange color through the center of this, through this loop. And we can see where the white population lives, where the Black population lives, where the Hispanic, maybe Black is the blue and then Hispanic is the purple. We can see how the populations divide around these, this infrastructure, a lack of connectivity, a lack of impacts on real estate and so forth. And we can see that if you study all the neighborhoods that were impacted from the 1950s through the 60s, all the neighborhoods, these are the neighborhoods that were largely impacted by urban highways. And that's, the vast majority are non-white population that were disproportionately affected. So connectivity and repair in cities is a critical path forward through the wounds and the harm done in the past. And there's some happy stories to be told about this, which is Rochester, New York is a leader in the highway removal process in which they took out, this is the same before and after photo, they took out this ring road, which was a deep cut that separated a minority population from the downtown core, and they filled it in, making a surface level boulevard, but also sites for new mixed use buildings that will have affordable housing, some of which are already built. And so now you have, instead of just having, say, 2 places where you could cross the neighborhood, now pretty much on every block, you have a street where you can walk down to your new job, to, the city hall to get your driver's license or your marriage certificate, and so forth. Right now, John Taylor, who's in the room, and I are teaching us our urban concentration studio in historic Anacostia and Fort Stanton neighborhood. And this is Fort Stanton Park up here in the top. And what we immediately, and our students are well aware of at this point, is how this very, one of the poorest neighborhoods of income in Washington, D.C. is just fraught with so many questions and problems. And part of it, what you don't know from this image is the incredible topography that's already limiting connectivity across this territory. But also the park itself becomes this kind of donut hole in which, the public housing residents over here feel no connectivity to the historic district that's down over here around the Frederick Douglass House as a major landmark in the middle. So working on repair of these places, working on the connectivity of the population. How can humans flourish when they're isolated in these pockets and kind of kept at bay in those pockets? And you could see that sense of isolation and lack of connectivity even in very modern developments. So here we are in Hudson Yards in Manhattan. This is the train yard for Penn Station, which is just out of the view of the picture. And Hudson Yards, for anyone who's been there, I'm not complaining about the architecture, which I definitely would, but I'm complaining so much about the lack of connectivity to the rest of New York City. This was a case where the developer was able to drive the urban design of the project and chose to build an enclave that would really be about the mall and all the wealthy foreign money that could be pouring in to buy the condos and the units in these buildings to help actually even fund the project. So connectivity can be used in so many ways to separate populations and deprive people of certain types of access, let alone the fact that I always love the anecdote that, and my wife could confirm this, she was sitting on these steps by the vessel one day to organize family visit to the vessel because that was the new hot object in New York. And the privately owned public space guard came over to her and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, you're not allowed to sit there on those steps." So this is also about the kind of policing of these kind of spaces. So if we think about connectivity on the one hand as a kind of a critical need of repair and connectivity, then we have to think about the ecology of our planet, the ecology of our places. And there's nothing that makes you think of ecology more and human flourishing more than a moment where you feel like the air is poison. And so this summer, when the wildfires were burning in Canada, this is the New York Times photograph of New York City that day, the day that New York had even higher particle counts than Delhi, which is usually at the highest level across the world. So you walk outside your door and the air is poison. What could be more against human flourishing than that? We may as well start wearing spacesuits at that point. So we need to think about our natural condition and what we need to do to deal with it. Certainly, we've seen like 11 people drowned in New York City 2 summers ago in their apartments because of massive rainstorm. We saw massive rainstorms even a few weeks ago in New York City that flooded, 5 feet of standing water in certain intersections around the city. We see all sorts of parts of the city, cities all over the United States and certainly around the world that are on coastlines that were flooding. They were built, they built down into filled land. This is a reconstruction of the historic landscape of Manhattan and this exact part of Manhattan, which had all the drainage from the hills around it, as well as a coastal marsh, tidal marsh right here. And this is the neighborhood that was built in there. Of course, a lot of public housing, a hospital, really intelligent thing to do. And this is the FEMA flood map zone, which almost exactly matches the topography we can see in the historic photograph. So we see that cities have been built with a lot of misguided thinking, right? Or short-term thinking. Short-term, let's say 70 years of building or 80 years of building, where suddenly, now it's put lives at risk and it's put property values or real property at risk. And it's creating a problem where we're going to have to essentially start to abandon land like this and replan where those people are going to live and work. People are going to lose their homes and lose their businesses. There's almost no doubt about that. So the idea of repair, when we see that historic landscape, we ask, what can we do to work towards repair? Certainly, we can look at the automobile as a major part of this. Jane Jacobs famously wrote in her book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, cities are either doing one of two things. They're adding to the capacity of car traffic, or they're working against the capacity of car traffic. They can't be static because cars are, as we know, always like you build a new highway. Even Robert Moses built his first freeways, and within less than a decade, they were already packed with traffic. People were supposed to get out of the city and enjoy Jones Beach, but now they were stuck in traffic before they can even get to the beach. So getting people out of cars, into buses, onto bikes, walking through cities is an essential part of how we build a future of cities and how we repair the urban environment. Of course, that's a major culture shift, but that is a core issue. With cars and other certain aspects, if you study per capita, per household carbon footprint, you find that that urban life is actually incredibly beneficial. That's the blue, that's Washington, D.C. Sorry, this is Washington, D.C., that's Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, are all blue. And then all this other blue is rural landscapes where the the houses are, the density is very low, but all this different shades of red are all the suburban sprawl that surround the Northeast corridor. So living in an apartment, of course, has a very different impact on the land than living in a single family house. Here we see at the same more or less scale, a Long Island neighborhood and the neighborhood where my wife and I live in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And the people, the density of the population in the upper neighborhood is 3,000 people per square mile. The population in our neighborhood is 93,000 people per square mile. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily a magic number of density that we all need to imitate in our lifestyles, but we definitely have to think about the consumption of land and resources that this represents versus the different kind of impact per household on the land we see here. So New York City zoomed in on that same kind of chart. And it turns out actually that old buildings, old multifamily buildings in urban places, because they often use old oil-based boilers, they are pretty intensive per square foot in their energy compared to a single family house. But when you put it on a household basis, then the numbers are clear, and the single family home is an incredibly inefficient way to house people in terms of energy consumption. And all of this red is due to single family homes, right? And that's the vast majority of people in the United States live in a single family home. What do we need to do? Well, we need to look at how we allow more single family homes to be built. Many cities like Minneapolis is fighting to change the zoning and say everywhere that we have single family zoning, we're going to change that and allow multifamily zoning everywhere in the city. And is of course facing a lawsuit because of all the people that resist that kind of change and worry about their property values. So ideally, we would be having moratoriums on single family homes. Ideally, we would be really looking at how people can drive private vehicles wherever they want. New York City right now is pushing for congestion pricing that will charge people a fee to drive south of 60th Street and the rest of Lower Manhattan. The state of New Jersey is suing, as is Staten Island. They're suing. The suburban politicians in New Jersey say they have no right to tax us to drive in their city, but New Yorkers are saying this money will help fund the repair of the subway and make the subway so attractive that people won't even want to have a car to live in New York City, as I, by the way, have never owned a car in my life, which I'm very proud to say. So we need to think very carefully about all the modes of mobility. And by the way, electric vehicles are not a solution to that problem, because electric vehicles are still a person in a box taking up an immense amount of space on the urban street. We have to get people out of cars into other modes of transportation, including active forms, which are scooters and e-bikes and pedestrian activity, and all sorts of buses and different vehicles. So when we think about the repair of cities, we can think about European models and other models, but a big part of the discussion of cities, which is led by a professor at the Sorbonne in Paris, is this notion of the 15-minute city. 15-minute city, and this is from Dwayne Player-Zyberg's co-design office, shows how should we think about cities, and how can we bring more of the parts of daily life into immediate proximity so that we can, go to the doctor or drop off our kids at daycare or go to the grocery store or go to our job, wherever that might be, and so forth. Some places in the world see this as a highly controversial thing. In Oxford, England, they actually were protesting in the streets because they thought this was a government control process going to take their cars and lock them into their city. But I think that's a very, extremist view of this particular concept of the 15-minute city. It's about proximity. In my suburban neighborhood in Pittsburgh, if I walked 5 minutes, I was more or less nowhere. But in Rye in England, I would be outside. I would have left the city after 5 minutes. Or if I was in Nîmes, I could have walked from the center to this boulevard system that makes a ring around the core. Or if I was in Jenne and Mali, I could almost walk from one side of the city to the other in that amount of time. Cities have been historically, when I said this talk is not about my invention or my unique perspective, I'm really talking about, the history of humanity in urban form, and how, the idea of putting things in proximity through a balanced density has been the normative throughout human history until the 20th century. So of course, when we think about ecology, we should be thinking about how we can bring landscape features into our city centers. This is actually Canterbury, England, here on the right, this remarkable green city with this beautiful canal running down the middle. And of course, the English have a special ability, that's also Canterbury, to make green work, and they have the right weather. But of course, we need to plant and bring plant material into our urban areas. We need the shading of the greenery. We need the cooling aspects of it. We need the ecological aspects of allowing flora and fauna in the biodiversity that comes with all this greenery. And just to show some examples of professional work that are not mine, and not even within the rubric of an organization I'm part of called the Congress for New Urbanism, I want to show that I think urbanists all over, from every kind of background of approaching architecture and design, are thinking the same things. This is not really anymore a major debate in the architectural communities or the landscape urban communities. So this is the work of Michael van Valkenburg's office, which I think is quite beautiful. And we see a project here outside of Houston, on the edge of Houston, which is an old bayou river, of course, a place that has to deal with flooding and so forth. And you can see all the principles that they are laying out for their project, as well as this, it's blocked by this window here, but they talk about the connectivity of the housing. They talk about anyone who's displaced by this project. They've got, new extended neighborhood housing to help prevent displacement. And look at the principles that we see here listed on this drawing. We see extend the neighborhood fabric, leverage properties, create a safe, resilient waterfront. The one that's hidden here, and when we see on the top right, new connections, right? So connection is a word that appears in all the projects I can see from this firm's work, including here in Toronto. The same idea, streets and blocks. They talk about a rich, fine-grained, a continuous public realm of fine-grained streets and sidewalks will be integrated into the surrounding neighborhoods. So none of these ideas are unique to a practitioner, but I think they are essential to all of us. And one reason I'm so excited to present this today, and here's the book that helped inspire or grant me some honor to be here, is that we as architects, we don't have to all be the same urban designer, but we certainly cannot work as architects without this knowledge, without this context, without how we are helping avoid the harm and build into a system that is leading to human flourishing. How does our building on this site for this client help propel human flourishing? So I was inspired by many of the ideas from this book, and while I'm the editor of the book, this is a edited volume with authors from all over the world, from Australia, from Norway, from England, from Bangladesh, and so forth, and from the Philippines. And they were exploring throughout this book issues that kind of inspired a lot of what I'm saying today. For example, Italian in Italy and Norway, they were thinking about the edges of cities and how the design of the edge of a city is a critical interface with natural systems, not just because it's maybe beautiful or not just because it gives us an opportunity to be out in nature, but because we need a relationship with nature. We can't live in a society of cars and single family homes and see nature as something that is like, what we do, say, on a weekend and go for a hike. We are surrounded by nature. We are part of nature. Pope Francis, in his most latest Laudate Deum, says that when we care for the natural world, we're caring for each other. And I couldn't, if you read Laudate Deum, you get an incredibly powerful argument of our role to help repair the natural world. So that idea from that conference led to a new conference on livable cities, which I just helped organize and lead in New York this summer, which is going to lead to a kind of second volume related to that, which is going to be on wellness and health. But when we think of wellness in the world today, and again, if I go back to that lit review of all those different issues, loneliness is the new epidemic that we can see being written about in so many places. Our mental health, we're in a mental health crisis. We don't even understand how the isolation of the pandemic has impacted us mentally. We're still coming to terms with that. So we have a lot of work to do, and we need to keep expanding the way that we are thinking about urban places and how they impact us. And so if we looked at connectivity in general, and if we looked at ecological systems and all the ecological relationships of cities to an environmental kind of sustainability and resilience, we can then also talk about things that are about social infrastructure. I said at the beginning that streets and squares, I believe, are fundamental social infrastructure in cities. And I say this, even though that sounds like an obvious statement, I say it because I see all the time places where, say, especially students of architecture, don't consider the street as a part of their project. The street is always a part of the project. The buildings, the incredible architecture we see here on the Lower East Side, which is humble architecture. These are all walk-up tenement buildings. But look at how the architecture enhances the sense of street. This is placemaking. This is where, as Jane Jacobs says, the vast majority of a day in the city is going about doing your everyday activities, and you're surrounded usually by strangers. How does that work? How does it work that we're around strangers all the time and it's all working together? She says it's not perfect, it's not a utopia, but she says most of the time when we're interacting with strangers in a city like New York, it is fortuitous. It's not antagonistic. The ability to walk down the street, and now I don't know about you, but after COVID, I definitely say smile at people when I see them on the street in New York. I might even be brave and say good morning, which was against the law before COVID, but now I think the law is softening a little bit. We have to think of streets and how we design streets as places. Let me just check my time. Lewis Mumford, in talking about cities, and I'm definitely running late. Lewis Mumford talked about cities, and he talked about how the city is like a theater. And I had this incredible experience in Rome, living in the apartment on the right, when the Teatro Valle on the left ran a production of Henry V, and they brought out, I heard all this racket. I had tickets to the second night. I heard all this racket, and I went out my window and looked down in the street, and there was Henry V surrounded by the audience on a box in the street, making the famous speech up before the battle in France. So the city can be a theater of sorts. Lewis Mumford says that it's in the city, it's in the public realm of the city where we resolve our issues. We bring our issues to each other, and we're aware of them. We see them all the time. So the city street, this is what I would usually have in my life in Pittsburgh growing up, is some approach to the mall. Whereas in Hanoi, the street is everything. It's the hustle and bustle and the pageantry and beauty of daily life. And Paris is the same. On the left is the New York Times image from Soho during COVID, the one person walking down the lonely street. We've learned a lesson about how these public spaces need to bring us alive. And certainly what the COVID era sheds that we have all over the US gave us a new sense of vitality of the street, and even a city like New York that was lacking beforehand. So the cars, so we have to think, this is Old Park Avenue on the left, New Park Avenue on the right. New York City has been a place where the car keeps winning day after day, stealing space from what was once for pedestrians or for landscape. We have to find a way to turn that around. So let me just jump ahead since I'm kind of behind. So in art, artists would depict just scenes of city street life. Down in Chinatown in New York, we see city street life with pedestrianized streets, just bustling with the beauty of human life. The same goes for public spaces, right? We've talked about streets, we talk about the square. The square we thought was going to be superseded by Facebook and other media, but I think we've learned very well that social media is not going to replace the power of being in public space together. This is a fall day last year in Central Park, where there's this beautiful little junction of a few pathways, and New York's secret sauce are these continuous benches that allow a whole bunch of strangers to sit in close proximity around this space. And of course, the buskers playing beautiful jazz appreciate the opportunity to make a small theater out of this space. But public squares in the American cities, as I learned in downtown Brooklyn, there's kind of a weird, tenuous relationship we have with public space. When protesters, public space is critical for society, because when things happen, people do have to take to the streets. We need public space to be seen and to be heard. When the planners of 1811 planned Manhattan, they threw in some public squares, but they said in their document with this plan, we don't really think public squares are a thing. We don't want to do anything like what you find in London or Paris, figural spaces for public buildings. And of course, Central Park is not on this plan. So they just kind of threw a scattering of plans, but it was a real incredible lost opportunity to weave public space through this great city. Brooklyn was even worse. In 1834 or 43, they planned this image on the left, and they showed where they might put in some new haphazard squares. The yellow ones they never built. And they also wanted to put in some roads that would connect people better. They were never built, the red lines. And in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1843, an incredible record of the time, we see that people, and I've saw all sorts of articles in this paper from the early 1800s, where people are begging for public space in the city, and it was not being delivered. So there were forces at hand that stopped that. In Lower Manhattan, actually, it was the developers who gave us some great public squares. But some of those squares didn't last long. This is St. John's Square, developed by Trinity Church. You see the painter's image. That's what the square looked like. It was developed by 1852. By 1911, they decided it was a great site for a freight depot. That's a kind of good testament to public space in New York. This is where my family has been living since 2005, the Upper East Side. It's actually the densest, has some of the densest census tract areas of all of New York City, this neighborhood. We can use the mapping of like I showed from Redondo Beach, oops, hit the wrong button. From Redondo Beach, we can see we can chart the trajectory of this urbanization over time, and we can put it in comparison to, say, that Lower Manhattan zone. You can see all the squares from Washington Park, Tompkins Square, and so forth on the left. The same exact land area in the Upper East Side has one that doesn't have a single square in this particular iteration of the urbanization. So what was driving that? Certainly speculation was a huge part of that. So public squares, public spaces are where we can not only have people coming together, but we can generate meaning, like the dancers we saw in Nîmes when we arrived in Nîmes on the Friday that happened to be their music festival. What a powerful experience of seeing people celebrating their culture in their city streets. Every square had a different type of band. The old timers were dancing, and they probably remembered when their grandparents were dancing in that same square. People in Nepal, much of this was impacted by in Kathmandu, impacted by the earthquake. But we see the living city and the spiritual city and the shrines all merging together in this beautiful setting. In Hanoi, we have this great lake of the returned sword with a monument in the middle of the lake, which is like a sacred foundational myth. It's like an Excalibur story. In the 16th century, a general was able to get a magic sword and defeat the Chinese. And then he was greeted by a turtle who told him to return the sword into this lake. And the shrine commemorates that return of the sword. So this is certainly a place you would think of great sacredness and meaning, but it's also the place of great social life of the city of Hanoi. This is where the city shuts down the streets and comes out every weekend. Looks like this, as far as I can tell, in Hanoi from my experience there. In the beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Site of Djenné in Mali, on the Niger River is this the Great Mosque of Djenné. And the BBC documented how the Great Mosque of Djenné every year needs to be restuccoed to protect the mud brick construction from the rainy season. So the whole town comes out and does it together. And they each have their own section and they're kind of competing with each other. And you can see the kids who are probably out there with their grandmas who can tell them about how this is passed on from generation to generation. So the public spaces of our cities, the urban form, has huge potential to have these meaningful places that carry us from one generation to the other, that endow our human life every day with great meaning. So I'm just going to jump ahead. So in China, of course, this is how urbanism has been done. And everything we just described is not what we're seeing here. People have to queue up for the grandparents queue up for the bus at about 4 o'clock in the morning so their kids can get a seat on the bus to ride into their jobs on the city bus. That's the kind of urbanism that we're seeing in China. And of course, much of this from the New York Times is sitting empty because they built too much. So I'm a card-carrying city lover. This is the view from my daughter's school's rooftop in Manhattan. I think there's a majestic quality of urban places that gives us an ability in a time when life is so tough and we feel kind of beat down. David Brooks of the New York Times wrote about the other day how we live in a time of a brutalizing time, how it's so hard to feel empathetic towards anyone else. How can we possibly do that? My wife and I lived through 9/11 in New York. We lived through the blackout in 2003. We lived through Superstorm Sandy. And I can tell you, every one of those events, I was proud to be a New Yorker about how the city came together and was so strong. It's a great example. Of course, it's a unique place. And it's not like you can just take New York and copy and paste it all over the world. But New York shows the potentiality of urban life and human flourishing. So just to bring us close to a conclusion, I want to just read a quote of Richard Rogers, a modernist architect of great renown, great work. One of my favorite places in the world is the Pompidou Center Plaza in Paris, which is a remarkable place. And here he is writing a foreword for a 2010 book by Jan Gehl, who's considered one of the great urban thinkers of our time. And this is what Richard Rogers says. Cities are the places where people meet to exchange ideas, trade, or simply relax and enjoy themselves. A city's public domain, its streets, squares, and parks, is the stage and the catalyst for these activities. Jan Gehl, the doyen of public space design, has a deep understanding of how we use the public domain and offers us the tools we need to improve the design of public spaces, and as a consequence, the quality of our lives in cities. The compact city with development grouped around public transport, walking, cycling, is the only environmentally sustainable form of city. So says Richard Rogers. However, for population densities to increase and for walking and cycling to be widespread, a city must increase the quantity and quality of well-planned, beautiful public spaces that are human in scale, sustainable, healthy, safe, and lively. Final slide, I promise. In 1995, as a relatively new graduate, I was a graduate student at the time, I was commissioned to do the drawing on the right. I was commissioned this for a conference called the Art of Building Cities that was held at the Art Institute in Chicago. I was working with Dimitri Porphyrios at the time, so I always have to give Dimitri credit for how we came about the devising of this drawing. But we started with a quick discussion of Ambrosio Lorenzetti on the left. And I said, well, that's clearly a touchstone if we're going to talk about the art of building cities in the 20th century. So what I did was I began to compose this drawing around my experience of, say, downtown Pittsburgh growing up, which was, office towers kind of isolated with plazas around them, a waterfront that was kind of neglected with, trash thrown over the side, with on the right, big box stores surrounded by parking lots and heavy speed roads with giant walls around them because the traffic noise was too loud and the suburban houses behind. And then I said, well, if we want to look at how we're going to build the city, the artist is standing on the hilltop and he's painting or she's painting this new vision of the city using the old library in the center as the inspiration of a starting point. And instead of a parking lot across the library, there's a park. And instead of buildings standing in isolation, they're buildings of the same scale focused on the streetscape. Instead of monofunctional buildings, there are mixed-use buildings. Public transportation rather than cars in all places. The public realm reimagined and cared for with beautiful architecture. The landscape across the city preserved with a limitation of where you build and having agriculture and forest surrounding cities to get the beauty and the life from that place. So this drawing for me brings me back to this to something that I touched upon many years ago in my life, which was this idea of repair. How can we repair and build new cities around human flourishing? Thank you very much for your patience. Oh, yeah, yeah.
All right, I have a question for Jason.
I know we ran past time, so I thank you all for lingering.
I'll make this quick. Is this one? All right, sweet. So as an architect in a professional field, how are you supposed to repair a city or specifically a historical city, if you have no connections to that city? Is there a process of interviewing the residents of that city?
Well, certainly, there are all sorts of levels of what's called participatory design, and certainly, and there's also collaborations and interdisciplinary collaborations that can happen. So for sure, like when we were going with John and our students, we go to Anacostia and Ward 8. You know, I've never lived there, although my mom went to high school there. You know, I don't look like the people that live in that neighborhood at all. I don't know what their immediate concerns and so forth. So of course, it's essential that you are tapping into the local knowledge and that you're working to make sure that, as we heard earlier in this lecture series, you're not doing harm. And then you also can collaborate with other activists and leaders who are totally immersed in a community. And you can bring, what I'm trying to show here is like, there's a fundamental knowledge of how cities can function. Richard Rogers says it's the compact city is the only approach. So if we want to understand how to serve a community, we have to start by understanding these most important essential nature of cities. And then we can bring that knowledge to serve a community and serve their needs and their understandings. And we might help them understand things about cities that they're not aware of if they're not in that professional, from that professional perspective. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Jason, I just have to give you a big hug. I couldn't agree more with everything you said, and you recited all my favorite designers and planners, other than the tall guy in New York City. But how would you? And I recently worked on this myself. Sprawl, mall, tall.
Yes.
They're isolations.
Yes.
And now we've had a new one called virtual.
Yeah.
Which is, while on the one hand connecting a lot of people, it's also isolating them. The heart of what I saw was human enjoyment, human happiness. So those are just underscores of everything you're saying. But I think the hardest question for me these days is looking at the new urbanism and saying, okay, I can't do New York City again. Who could create New York City again?
Yeah, sure.
But having lived there and having lived on the Lower East Side and all the places you've talked, but it seems to me like J.C. Nichols and all those guys, when they did downtown, Kansas City, as I said, J.C. could do everything except walk on water.
Yes.
He came up with these heights. So do you have any formula about the ratios that new urbanism has with this width of the street and the height? Because the one thing I've noticed is the more I get into higher and higher cities and higher buildings, a certain kind of isolationism really pokes at you. So getting rid of sprawl, mall, and tall, and now virtual,
yes,
to me is my formula. But I'm just more curious for everybody to hear from you about the heights and the ratio of the streets.
Yeah.
That's
so I've never,
critical.
for example, been to Hong Kong but I just saw some pictures because my wife's cousin's daughter was moving to Hong Kong, and the husband is a photographer, so he sent some images. And of course, I've seen some things about Hong Kong. Certainly, I can understand that, you know, tall, narrow streets can be isolating. And I've seen certainly images, and there's a great film called Human Scale by Yang Gale's office, and it opens with scenes of Chinese apartment dwellers in some of these massive high buildings, just the real sense of isolation. I'm definitely not promoting a particular formula for density. I do think density should not be a dirty word, which it is to many Americans. They hear density. California has continuously voted against densifying multifamily housing, affordable housing around transit-oriented places, all over, which would help the housing crisis. But they keep saying, no, density is almost like an evil to them. You know, it impacts their property values. So I don't think there's any golden rule to density and to the street sections. I do think street sections, for example, might start to narrow if extreme heat continues the way it is, and we actually need to shade the public realm more than we currently are. I think we have to get creative on that. I would say, the level that, like, in Seattle right now, they're working on legalizing 6 stories walk-ups with one means of egress, like you find very much around Europe. It's usually 3 stories is the limit. And they're looking at, what the data says about safety, about combining it with certainly fireproof construction and sprinklers and so forth. But the studies are showing that if you could expand to 6 stories of, where you can have a single entrance and a single core, you can actually increase density at 6 stories and get much greater land use results in terms of dwelling units per acre. So I think there's a lot of creativity going on, and certainly I would love to see Catholic students exploring the question that you're describing. I don't have a definitive answer for that.
Jason, I agree with everything that you said. It's fantastic. Like you, I'm also a city lover. And I appreciate all the cities that you mentioned. I have visited most of them, so I couldn't be more appreciative. I wanted to ask you about, I'm fascinated by your use of the word repair. I think it's a fascinating word, but it's also deeply problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Why? When you repair something, you are subtly you're trying to go back to an past ideal state, which you are trying to restore. But of course, as you would know, cities are dynamic phenomenon. They change, demographics change, cities' economies change, and it's a kind of a dynamic process. So when you repair, how do you kind of balance the evil effects of gentrification or redlining, the traumas of redlining?
Right.
How do you kind of sort of mitigate these traumatic events of the past in your well-intentioned project of repair? So I'll give you an example. I don't know if you ever been to Seoul, South Korea.
Yeah.
There is a kind of an ancient canal that kind of goes through the heart of the city. In the 1960s, that a major expressway was built literally above that canal. About 20 years ago, that highway, elevated expressway, was taken down, and the ancient canal was restored again. So I thought it was a great project, and I was in Seoul and I was walking it has become a very vibrant public place. People walk. It's kind of the heart of the city. But as I was walking along the Cheonggyecheon, as it's called, Cheonggyecheon Restoration Project, I was talking to people, and I was talking to some local investors, local small businessmen along they were saying that yes, it was a great project. It has gentrified the city, but it also evicted some of these small investors.
Right.
So I would like to ask you, as you repair, how do you deal with this type of issues?
Yeah, so certainly like the class I developed in Brooklyn, Learning Places, gentrification was the #1 topic brought to us by the students, right? Who are many were from, the average family income for the college where I was teaching, family income was $30-some thousand at City Tech. So I was working with a population of students that were keenly aware of, disadvantaged communities, neglected places and so forth. And so they always zoomed in on gentrification. When I say repair, like the project we did in Brooklyn, actually, where we looked at downtown Brooklyn, we actually did everything we did with connections and almost no demolition. For example, there was no displacement involved. We were connecting people. I have another project in my portfolio of the Farragut houses nearby, which are isolated towers in a landscape that nobody makes use of. And so my goal there was to look at repair to bring those towers back into conversation with the city fabric around them, with streets and public spaces, so that the semi-public space is not a detriment to the community living in the towers. There's no easy answer. Like obviously the High Line, for example, is like taking advantage of a great opportunity in New York City, and it's led to crazy skyrocketing prices and certainly displacement about it. In the UK, they're trying to repair council housing, and they have actually an interesting formula in the UK where they've developed a legislative process where the impacted community gets an independent advocate or advocacy group that works with them to talk through any physical changes that are going to be happening in their neighborhood. And that person is completely their client is the community, no one else. And that person then helps them go to public meetings and represent themselves and stand up for their rights and help negotiate any changes that would then be acceptable to the local population. I think when it comes to displacement and gentrification, there's a huge amount of subtle stuff, much of it at a policy level, certainly at a human relation level of discussion and negotiation. The case of Redondo Beach, I don't think you're ever going to tear down those incredible condos on the waterfront. But I think in that case, what we were looking to do was re-knit together in the parking lots and largely unused space. We were trying to re-knit an urban fabric that they took away and the city lost. So I think there are notions of repair you can talk about that aren't inherently gentrifying, but I think gentrification is a central issue for work, and of course I should have talked about it as a more bigger part of my story, but I don't think there's a silver bullet to stopping gentrification, but I think you have to always be aware of when you can. That's the harm. Certainly, gentrification is a major harm in society, and we have to always be aware of how we can work to avoid displacement first and most, but also the people who live in a place. The South Bronx is developing like crazy right now. The South Bronx burned to the ground largely because of neglecting landlords who wanted to get out of the neighborhood. And those people that saved the neighborhood are now being surrounded by new market rate housing. That's a great case of very likely gentrification and displacement. Does the city of New York have a great mechanism to work on that? I haven't seen it or heard of it yet. So maybe, there's lots of work and there's lots of research to be done about gentrification.
The Lower East Side is a good example. I mean, a long-term 30-year gentrifying.
Yes. Hit snap your fingers. Yeah. Yeah. I hope I addressed your question adequately.
Congratulations, Jason. Thank you for a fantastic presentation and for celebrating the city and the democratic city, these the public spaces. I wondered if you can comment on, I think, a dynamic that we're seeing that you referred to. I was taken by the example of Hudson Yards, where the inequality, so that is reflected in developments such as that are enlisting many of these sort of positive aspects of urbanism. I mean, they're bringing public art and spaces, but and indeed, these are the commissions and architects that are being lauded within the profession. But the end result seems to be sort of the opposite of a democratic city, and indeed, sort of a anti-city, as you've sort of described it. Yeah, as students and educators, how to take this on or contend with this, where you have sort of a corrupting effect of some of these great symbols or elements of urbanism, but being taken for I think kind of deleterious or negative impacts in the city fabric. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things, but maybe with time short, I would say, Hudson Yards is a perfect example of what's called privately owned public space in New York City, where developers, the city is not developing public space anymore. They're relying on the development community to provide them. And there are, of course, negotiations and rules about what can happen in those public spaces. But the sense of the corporate oversight of public space, of so-called public space, I think is a huge problem. And New York, I think other cities around the world haven't abandoned it like New York, such a developer money-driven city. So all over New York are these kind of spaces where you don't, from a democratic point of view, I had a librarian, I love to work with librarians. My mom, of course, was a librarian. So at City Tech, I had a bunch of librarians that I would teach with that Learning Places course. And one of them was a real activist and kind of provocateur. And she would take her students into the privately owned public space across the street from campus called Metro Tech. And she would have her students do things that she, perform or make noise or do other things that she thought might provoke the privately owned public space police of that space. And it was an opportunity for the students to really understand what, it's like, what a public realm can mean, and how people trying to put limitations on your ability to protest or to speak your mind or just even be crazy in a public space. The tolerance is so little. I had to skip over a huge segment I wanted to talk about the lack of provision of public space in New York City. I think Hudson Yards is a case where the public space is designed primarily for a playground for the people coming in and out of the mall, or to help a marketing gimmick to get more people into the mall, which is suffering, by the way, thankfully. So I think the city shouldn't give, that we should work with a new development strategy where public space is public space, and the city can fund it and developers can pitch money into it, but it's a city managed process, not a developer managed process. I think that would be a really critical change.
Any last question? Couldn't go any farther, huh?
So full disclosure, Ani is my research assistant, helping me with some of this great research, and I'm really appreciative of his help.
Okay. My question is, what are the three crucial strategy that you will put in place to better the relationship between streets and people? As students, we know that we can make the streets wider, and also adding bike trails, and also make the sidewalk. So what are other three crucial strategy that you will put in better the relationship between the streets and also the people?
Great question, Ani. In that lit reviews section I showed you, Johns Hopkins just literally put out a study of 1,000 streets across the United States in different cities. And they said undoubtedly the number one thing in that list was to narrow the traffic lanes. My son is about to get his driver's license, which is a little bit scary. He's learning how to drive in New York City. You have to pay $2,000 and get some driver to drive around New York City to prove you're worthy of getting a license in New York City. It's a crazy process. And New York is crazy to drive in because the taxis are changing lanes left and right every 5 minutes or every 5 feet. Narrowing traffic lanes has a huge impact on the speed cars are going, the care in which the cars are going, pedestrian safety, and so forth. So narrowing traffic lanes would be number one. Of course, what is narrowing traffic lanes gives you more space. In New York, 80% of the public realm is the streets themselves. So if every foot you take back from the roadbed, you give it back to pedestrians. And by the way, most of the sidewalks in New York were wider historically and got narrower when the city kept saying, well, if we just add another traffic lane, I'm sure we won't have another traffic jam in New York City. So Third Avenue in our neighborhood just got reduced from a 5-lane free-for-all to a bus lane and 3 zones of traffic and a new protected bike lane. That's exactly, we need to add protected bike lanes in. We think, I would say Fifth Avenue and Broadway in Manhattan should be 100% bicycle dedicated. And we need to slow traffic down. We need to reduce the attractiveness of driving a private vehicle by yourself through a city. The streets themselves define the street. Setbacks on streets are not usually advantageous. Holding street walls, bringing the activity in close proximity to the pedestrian, having great ground floor activity and transparency is also, like, if you read this book and you'll have most of those answers. Actually, it's not my thinking. I'm just talking about what many thinkers have been doing for decades. So narrow their lanes, widen the sidewalks, great activity on the streets, protected bike lanes, and shade. I can tell you in New York, I know immediately when that heat hits, I'm navigating the city based on what the shady side of the street is.
Well, this has been a good way to finish the semester's lecture. Thank you, Jason.
Thank
We
you.
meet you there.